All right, welcome everyone. It is October 20th, and we are meeting for the second consecutive week for our VISD Bond Planning Task Force. You're going to see several times tonight on several different slides a web link. I've put it here on this first page. Really appreciative of the work that our communications department and Ashley Scott have done to create and revamp our bond planning task force website. We also have a YouTube video channel for VISD where each of our bond planning task force meetings, those videos will live in this spot on the website for you, if you're not able to attend, to review after the fact, or for our community to be able to see and keep up with the work of this bond planning task force throughout the next several months. I want to start again by thanking you. I know that many of you were able to join us for our meeting last Tuesday, and we had a few who were not able to be here last Tuesday, but are joining us tonight. I want to thank you for your time, your dedication to the school district, your willingness to help us through this very important conversation for our community. In our meeting last week, we reviewed what the charge of this task force is, and I think it's important for us to revisit that conversation in our first several meetings so that we have top of mind what the work of the task force is. The charge of the bond planning task force is to, one, utilize a facility study and needs assessment to analyze and recommend short, mid, and long-term bond and facility efforts. The charge is also to ensure that we're discussing a broad range of possible actions and ultimately culminating with a recommendation or recommendations to the superintendent and the board from this task force. Also want to cover our virtual meeting norms or meeting expectations for us as a task force group, sort of our commitments for how we will work together as a task force group. One, I mentioned earlier before we started recording that we value your time and will make every effort to begin and end all of our meetings on time. We know that 2 hours is a long stretch of time, and so we encourage you, if needed, to take personal breaks as you need to. We are going to be talking about a range of topics, and none of them are simple. And so we ask that as we are sharing our perspectives, and at times they will differ, that we are respecting all opinions, that everyone in this group we recognize has an important voice as a part of our community. And so we want everyone to participate and have their voice heard and ensure that we're doing that in a fair and equitable way so that no one person or small group is dominating the conversation. This is specific to Zoom meetings. We've certainly learned over the last several months that it can become challenging to hear if several people have their mute button off with background noise. So we're going to ask that during the time that you are not speaking, that you have that mute button on to reduce distractions. And then again, as a reminder, we want to make sure that we communicate in every way possible the work that's happening in our school district, that we are as transparent as we can possibly be with this information. And so one of the ways that we go about doing that is to make this information and these conversations available to our community. So we are recording these meetings, and they are available again at that web page listed there at the bottom of the screen. In terms of today's agenda, first of all, I'll do a brief recap of what we covered last week for those who weren't able to join us. We will have some information on our bonding capacity and tax impact scenarios. We're going to be joined tonight by one of our financial advisors, Ann Intrican, who you will meet in just a little bit. And we will follow that conversation up with a small group discussion and then a large group share out for the task force. We will also have some conversation around short, mid, and long range planning cycles. Mike Vermeeren from Huckabee Architects will provide that information. We'll get a little rundown on construction costs in today's day and age. So Construction Costs 101 will be covered by Dan Luttrell from Huckabee Architects. Mike from Huckabee Architects will then come back in and share with us some information on considerations that districts may give when having to consider renovations of buildings versus new construction. And then we will follow up that conversation with a small group discussion and large group share out as well. We have a very full agenda tonight. On the meeting one recap, one of the things that we talked about last week that I think is important to address again is that in our school district, we have a way of doing things where we identify that there are certain aspects of our work that are complicated and certain aspects that are complex. Those things that are complicated typically have one right answer. Typically, there's an expertise there where someone has studied and that's the job they do. They're a professional in that job. It's the reason that we have a financial advisor here to talk with our group tonight. That's certainly an expertise. It's learned over time through study. We have architects here. That's another expertise. I would not be good at that. We also have complex issues. Complex issues are the issues around which we form task forces. Issues like merging campuses, closing campuses last year, issues around rezoning because of population changes. Bond planning is another one of those complex issues. It's an issue where there isn't one right answer. And so we bring a community group together that has different experiences and different connections to the school district so that we can discuss thoroughly those complex topics. So that's where this work will be focused, is in those complex areas of bond planning. Just want to reiterate something we talked about last week. We have, when we're all together, about 40 members of the bond planning task force, and previously have defined consent or consensus of this group as unanimous consent, which means at the end of the day, when we come together to try to form recommendations to share with the board, that we can say, I can support that. While we know that there's going to be a lot of items discussed and we may not agree on every single item, when we look at whatever recommendations may come forward in totality, that the group can say, I can support that, minus potentially a few of our task force members. We talked about the fact that we wouldn't want to set such a high bar in this important work that if one task force member said, I can't support that, that it meant that the work stopped altogether. We also discussed last week the school district funding sources. We specifically talked about the maintenance and operation, or M&O, tax rate, and how this is the portion of the tax rate that funds our typical operational costs. Salaries, supplies, utilities, and routine maintenance are examples of things that fall within the maintenance and operations tax rate. I've highlighted this next line item in yellow because it's really where our conversation lies tonight and around bond planning. The second part of a school district's tax rate is known as the interest and sinking, or INS tax rate. It's also sometimes referred to as the debt service rate. And this is the portion of the tax rate that funds new construction, renovations, significant repairs, and large purchases such as land, buses, or technology. We also talked last week about demographic projections or enrollment projections. We did a demographic study just last year that looked at our projections for enrollment over the next decade. And what we learned is that we really have a stable population in Victoria. We're not growing. We're really not declining. Over the next 10 years, we're expected to be in a very similar place in our enrollment as a school district 10 years from now as we are right now in 2020. We also covered the bond process or bond planning process outline. And what we learned from this is that the bond planning process and the time from discussing and prioritizing potential needs for a bond issue to the time that things actually occur, that is a long runway, and that it can, in some cases, especially if you're building a new school or making significant repairs to a school or renovations, that may happen over the course of 2 to 3 years as you're going from the early planning phase right now to potentially your community approving it to the time that those projects are actually able to be completed. We also briefly covered our facility assessment overview. So we covered the 20 or so facilities, campuses, and district facilities that were a part of the facilities assessment and the various aspects of each of those facilities that were reviewed as a part of that facilities assessment that occurred last year. Just as a reminder for those who weren't here, all of those facility assessment documents are available online at the website that I showed you earlier and that I will show you at least 2 more times tonight. So all that information is available to you and to all of our public. Oh, there it is. So the link to the YouTube video from last week's meeting, and this link will also take you to the presentation from last week, along with all of those facility assessment documents can be found at that little blue link at the bottom of this page. Last thing we discussed in our first meeting was the time frame for the work ahead. It's important for us to know where we're going and the time elements involved in that. So we have 7 scheduled meetings. We had our first last week. We are in our second tonight. The 7th is scheduled for December the 8th. We also know that we are moving toward potentially bringing forward a recommendation from this task force in either December or January. And so I've listed the December 17th and the January 21st. Those are the already scheduled, regularly scheduled board meeting dates. So if we are at a point in December or early January where the task force feels like we are ready to bring forward some form of recommendation to the superintendent and board, then we will do so at that time. It's also important to note the February 12th date, in that that is the last date that the Board of Trustees could take official action regarding any task force recommendations for a possible May 2021 bond election. It's required to happen, I believe, 78 days before the May election. And so if the task force is at a point where we're ready to make recommendations, they would need to occur in time for the board to be able to take official action by February the 12th. At this time, I'm going to invite Francis to come in and introduce our first presenter for tonight.
Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Ann Berger-Intrikin with Hilltop Securities. She has been our financial advisor for 32 years. She was first with First Southwest and now with Hilltop Securities. She has assisted the school district in the 3 bond issues that Dr. Bonewald mentioned last week, as well as helping us with refunding or refinancing our existing debt over the last 32 years. So she has a lot of history with VISD. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Ann.
Thank you so much, Francis. I really appreciate that introduction, and Dr. Bonewald. As Francis said, I've had the honor and pleasure of working with Victoria ISD for a number of years, and very much appreciate the opportunity to join you this evening to provide information about this process and analysis that you can utilize as you undertake the process relative to analyzing the potential for a bond issue. So Francis, if I may ask you to go to the first market page. Before we talk about actually bond capacity, I thought it might be helpful for me to spend just a few moments for the task force to explain where we are from a municipal bond market perspective. I'm sure many of you have had the opportunity to read articles or hear in the news about historically low interest rates and people who are refinancing homes and whatnot. Well, just as you're seeing and hearing that in other markets of interest, we also are experiencing that in the municipal bond market. This particular chart is called the Bond Buyers Index, and this is a 20-year history. This is an index that comes out every Thursday, and what it is intended to do is not give the exact interest rate that you would expect to get if Victoria ISD went out for a bond issue, but what it does, I believe it's an excellent barometer for what we're seeing in our municipal markets. And if you look just at this chart, which goes back to 2000, when this started, we were at about a 5.5%. And in the 2008 timeframe, the BBI, which we refer to it as, went all the way up to 6%. And if you look at where we are from a current perspective, the interest rate is a 2.35. What is interesting is I actually went back and researched it. The Bond Buyers Index started in January 5th of 1961. And the rates that we have now are the lowest rates in the history of the Bond Buyers Index. Prior to the current rates that we have now, the previous low we experienced in July of 2016. On the next slide, we have the same information, but what we wanted to do on this particular slide is just to go back and show you what has happened over the course of the last year. When we started, we were at about a 2.75, and now we're at a 2.35. But you can see with the M's in the middle of the chart, in and around the March timeframe, when all of the impacts from COVID hit, we had significant volatility in our market. Interest rates went up significantly, then they fell, then they went back up. And for the most part, they have continued to trail down. Really just over about the last 2 months have we seen interest rates start to go up just a little bit, but we are probably 25 or 30 basis points, or 25 basis points is equal to 0.25% from the all-time historic lows. On the next slide, we show what is called the Municipal Market Data, or MMD Municipal Yield Curve. And most bond issues have annual maturities going out 20 to 30 years. So what this shows in the bottom on the blue line is if you're a AAA rated entity, what interest rates you would expect to get over the course of the duration of the amortization. The red line shows a AA, the green line shows a single A, and the dark line at the top is a BAA. Now, Victoria ISD's underlying ratings are a AA- from Standard & Poor's and a AA2 from Moody's. So if you look at the underlying ratings and understanding that if there were to be a bond issue in the future, you would have the benefit of the permanent school fund guarantee, which means the bonds would trade as a AAA. Your expectations for the interest rates would be very close to the blue line at the bottom. And next slide. And one more, please. So before we think about the possibility or capacity relative to your consideration for this evening, I thought it might be helpful just to look at a snapshot of what Victoria ISD's current debt profile looks like. The chart on this page shows the existing debt service on an annual basis from 2021 out through 2036. The blue reflects the principal and the green reflects the interest. So over time, you are paying more principal and less interest. We intentionally, with our last bond issue, solved this so that your payments are pretty much what we call level debt service. They're just slightly over $9 million a year, each and every year. Next slide, please. We thought also it would be important for me to spend a few minutes to talk about the assumptions that we utilized in preparing the capacity analysis this evening. So we looked at amortization terms of 20 years, 25 years, and 29 years. And I believe that that's very important and wanted to highlight a couple of thoughts for your consideration. From a federal tax law perspective, the amortization term cannot exceed 120% of the useful life of the assets that are being financed. And generally, our recommendation to our clients is a little bit more restrictive than that. We generally recommend that our clients consider that the amortization term match the useful life of the assets being financed. And we do that because we really think it's prudent and fiscally conservative to not be continuing to pay debt service for a project that you're now having to undertake additional capital repairs fix. The next item that we have for our assumptions was our interest rate assumption. And we used current market rates plus 100 basis points or 1%. And to help frame how we came up with that, generally, I have utilized an interest rate cushion of 10 basis points or 0.10% per month between when the analysis is prepared and when potential issuance of bonds could occur. Now, as you saw in the market charts that we showed earlier, we've had many times where we've seen interest rates move 40, 50 basis points up or down in a week. And so there's no way really for us to be able to predict what the interest rates would be at the time of issuance. However, I believe it's very important in our role as the district's fiduciary to be conservative in our assumptions. And while we can't predict what's going to happen, our hope would be if this process were to move forward and if a decision were made to call a bond election and bonds were ultimately issued, our hope would be that we would be able to come back with results that are better than what we have shown in our projections. One other thing which I think is important, with the possibility of May elections, we work with our clients and we generally update the analysis in mid-January prior to the potential calling of a bond election in mid-February. We want to make sure that before you undertake more of the formal aspect of this process, that we are providing the most current analysis and assumptions that we have available. Just to frame this, I mean, we are in a position where there is a presidential election, and as we have seen many times over the last 4-year periods before, just the election in and of itself brings volatility to the market. So we just feel like, especially with the timing where we are now, if you move forward with this process, we would generally like to ask that you consider the opportunity for updated numbers as you would get closer to making that final determination. Again, in order to be conservative, we have utilized the actual fiscal year-end 2021 taxable assessed valuation with no growth assumed. Our analysis this evening, back to what Dr. Bonewall was talking about, the interest in sinking fund tax rate, we have projections that show no impact to that. Our proposed debt service structure that we looked at would be level debt, keeping the tax rate the same, but we also have declining debt service in order to provide future capacity. And based on the history of the district, we have utilized an ad valorem tax collection ratio of 98%. Next slide, please. And one more. So to summarize our projected capacity, for a 20-year amortization, with all of the assumptions that I talked about on the previous slide, we project a capacity for par amount of bonds of $72,110,000. That has a projected true interest cost of a 3.365%. And as I noted, that has about 100 basis points relative to what you would be able to expect in the market today. And we're solving for a projected INS fund tax rate of 0.2235. When we keep all of the other variables the same, but we just extend the amortization to be 25 years, the capacity increases with a projected par amount of $88,980,000 with a projected true interest cost of 3.774% and the same targeted tax rate as mentioned. And then when moving to a 29-year amortization, our projected par amount of bonds is $99,515,000 with a projected true interest cost of 3.964%. Next slide. And then moving on to the summary, we are in a municipal market where interest rates are near the historically lows that we have had since the 1960s. With the current debt structure that Victoria ISD has, it provides the ability to issue debt without a corresponding INS fund tax rate impact. As I mentioned before, we suggest that if there is a decision to proceed with a bond election, that we have the opportunity to provide updated analysis mid-January, and that finally the projects to potentially be included and their respective useful lives should be analyzed prior to finalizing the debt service amortization term. And with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So we do want to open this up to the group, and I apologize, I should have mentioned in advance, as we are going through presentations tonight and in the future, sometimes it's hard to start and stop with question and answer, but I do want to encourage us in the moment, as you see things that you want to ask about, that we put those questions in the chat box. You don't have to do that right now, but moving forward, as we move forward tonight with our architect presentations, if you see things and you want to ask a question, if you will, type that in the chat function. That way we'll keep record of it and we'll be able to address it. We recognize that this financial information can be like a different language for many, if this is not the world that you work in regularly. But we definitely want to open up any opportunity for questions that our task force may have around this information that Ann has shared out. One thing that we say in the teaching business is that wait time is very important. So we're going to celebrate those long, awkward pauses for just a bit from time to time in our presentations to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask.
And Dr. Bonewald, I want to be sensitive to the process, but clearly this was a lot of information. And if anyone doesn't have a question right now, but if they come up with a question, please provide that to Francis and Dr. Bonewald, and I will be happy to make sure I get back a response as quickly as possible.
Thank you for that offer, Ann. And I would just want to reiterate, with all of the information that we are potentially going to share out over the next several weeks, there may be times when the question hits you later, or it may just be that it's not a question you're comfortable asking in the moment. Please send those questions to me. I've already had folks after week one who gave me some additional information or asked for some additional information. And that's part of what we are here for in this process as facilitators. And we want to make sure you have all the information that you need. I see something popped up in the chat. Let's see. Can you click back to the scenarios? And they may be letting you off easy tonight.
Okay. Well, I sincerely mean my offer. If something comes up and you have any questions, please just let Dr. Bonewald know, and I'm happy to get a response to you just as quickly as possible.
I've got a question from Dana. We are in need of a great deal of technology upgrades. However, as rapidly as technology changes, is a 29-year bond advisable?
Okay, so that is a very, very good question, and a question that I receive many times from a whole different spectrum of clients. And so with what you are saying, technology, no, probably a 29-year bond issue specifically for technology would not be advisable. But for our clients that have multiple different projects that they plan on funding that have a wide variety of useful lives, there are about 2 different ways that we have worked with them to structure that debt. And I'm just using round terms for an example and just for purposes of illustration. But say, for example, you have a technology component, say, for example, and that has a shorter useful life. Say, for example, there's some renovation component, maybe that has the 17 or 18-year useful life. And then you have some more significant improvements that have a 30 or 35-year useful life. What we have done, there are 2 ways we have done that before. One, we have structured the debt where it's actually a stair step. We amortize the shorter stuff for a shorter period of time, the middle stuff a little bit longer, and the final stuff longer, and then we aggregate that up, and it's one bond issue, but it stair steps down over time. The other way that we've done it, and probably the more common way, is we undertake what's called a weighted useful life calculation. So we will work with the engineers and architects, and we will find a determination of what the projected dollar amount is, what the projected useful life is, and we will aggregate those all up and say, for example, if the weighted useful life of all the projects together is 29 or longer years, then absolutely it could be appropriate to do a 29-year bond issue. And then we would just be allocating the principal on the front end to the technology. The principal in the middle would be really allocated more to the mid-range projects, and the principal on the back end would be much more for the longer term projects. So there are several ways we can work with you once you have maybe a more clear picture of what your priority project list is, and we can get what their useful lives are and help make a determination for an appropriate amortization.
Oh, we're getting, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, that's all.
I thought we had a task force member coming in to ask a question. We do have a few other things in the chat. Dale mentioned that the district is collecting about 7 cents more in the INS fund than what is being spent to repay the current debt. If we used 3.5 cents as a tax swap to the M&O side of our tax rate, what would that allow for facility spending with the remaining cents? So I'm going to rephrase that, I think, to what would 3.5 cents on the INS side create in terms of available funding?
And that would not be a calculation I would be able to do right now, but it's one we are happy to update the analysis that we have prepared and provide a summary schedule similar to what you have on your screen that would be with a 3.5 cent targeted impact.
Thank you, Ann. And Dale, I appreciate the question, and it's representative of part of what our iterative process will be throughout this, in that we will bring information, and naturally as task force members, you're going to ask some really great questions for additional information, and we will follow up in the following weeks with that information and go back and forth until you have all of the relevant information that you need as individuals and as a task force as a whole. So we will definitely be following up with additional information around Dale's question. Suzanne has a question. How were the projected par bond amounts determined?
So what we did is we basically created multiple spreadsheets, which include the taxable assessed valuation. They include the tax rate that we are targeting. They include the collection ratio and the interest rate that we discussed. And basically we solve to where we can meet all of those assumptions and to keep your INS tax rate the same. And so we just kind of backed into, with the assumptions identified and keeping the tax rate the same, to calculate those numbers. And the reason that the par amounts actually get larger is the further out you go. Even with a little bit higher interest rate, as we have shown, having the more years of amortization does allow us to capture a little bit more capacity.
Any additional questions before we let Ann go tonight? That's the last one in the chat box so far. Well, Ann, we sure appreciate you and the work that you've put together to share with us tonight, and we'll look forward to following up with you in future weeks as our work continues forward.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a nice evening.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Uh-huh.
So this is going to lead us to our first small group discussion. For those in the group tonight who were not able to join us last Tuesday, I have set up for each of you to be a part of a small group. We've tried to divide those up to where we've got a broad representation, some folks that are parents, some community members, some staff, to where we can have robust conversation around different questions. And so in a moment, I will hit a magic button and send you into a small group, and I will bounce around just to check in on each group. And then ultimately, after about 12 minutes, I will pull you back into the large group. But before we do that, I want to tell you a story about mayonnaise and sweet potatoes. So here's the story about mayonnaise and sweet potatoes. As we go through this process, there are going to be some things that you likely have in your mind right now that you know, and they're going to remain true no matter what you hear in terms of additional information that we can bring or that your fellow task force members bring. There are going to be some things that for you are like mayonnaise for me, and that I don't like it, and I will never like it, and I don't want to have anything to do with mayonnaise. You can't convince me to change my mind. On the other hand, sweet potatoes. One of my great regrets in life is that all those years when I went to family gatherings and there were sweet potatoes as one of the options, that I turned my nose up at them because they looked weird to me. They weren't the white potatoes I was used to, but they were called potatoes. And it wasn't until sometime around my teenage years that someone finally got me to take a bite, and I realized what I was missing after I had more information. So for some topics, they may be like sweet potatoes, where we're going to ask you a question, you're going to discuss it right now, but as you learn from others and you learn from additional information over the coming weeks, your viewpoint may change some. So I'm going to ask you to keep an open mind, and let's look at everything like sweet potatoes right now. Our first small group discussion is a reflective question, and I put complex in quotes because remember, the work that we're doing is around complex questions. There's not one obvious, definite right answer. And as you go into small groups, you're likely to have people who see these things in different ways, and that's okay. We're going to give you about 12 minutes to talk about knowing we have some capacity at our current INS tax rate, what we just heard about from Ann, without raising the tax rate, we have some capacity that exists already. What level of tax increase would be supported by our community to address facility needs at this time? So that may be an answer of 0, no tax increase. It may be an answer of, I think if it's certain things, the community would support raising where that tax rate is now, or it may be another answer. But we want you to have some conversation around that question. Knowing we have some capacity currently, what level of tax increase would be supported by our community to address facility needs at this time? When we bring you back, we're going to ask that you have one spokesperson who takes 1 to 2 minutes to share out with the group what that conversation looked like in your small group. And knowing that we've got extroverts and introverts, I am going to ask that if you were a small group spokesperson last week, that you not serve in that capacity this week, that we share that responsibility and that opportunity from our small groups coming out to share out with our large group. So with that said, I am going to attempt to send you to your small groups now.
Were there any initial thoughts?
I think we're the quiet group this time.
What's that?
I said, I think we're the quiet group this time.
Yeah.
I'm on the fence. I'm not sure that how far a tax increase will be accepted. I think if it's for something that's vital, it will probably be a better sell than if we just say that we want to put Wi-Fi at the Memorial Stadium.
It seems to me that as we look at the overall needs that we have, that will be the determining factor of whether or not we think we ought to go forward with a tax increase. I'm not sure that with the current capacity that you can fix everything that you need. And I think if you have to sell a higher rate, then you've got to be sure that you're focused on what the critical needs of the district are. It doesn't make sense to me to pass a bond issue that doesn't fix the problems. If you've got to raise the tax a bit, then I think you have to raise the tax a bit.
I guess I look at it in the perspective that we have parts of the community that have rapid increase of appraised house valuation. So as a person whose taxes is raised every year, even when we moved them back with VISD, I still paid an additional $150 or $200, the next year. I think the valuations are kind of a concern based on what on what the city and county does. I am with Vic saying that it's very important that we fix the needs. We look at what we're doing and making sure we're having bang for our buck. I wasn't here when we did the last bond for the two high schools and the middle school in Cade, but I know we kind of fell short a little bit. So planning will be key, making sure we have a buffer to make sure we get everything we say we're going to get, making sure we build exactly what we wanted to if we need to build or replace or refurbish.
Our stadium needs some help, but I don't think that we really sold that.
It could be split.
You don't have to have it tied in there. You can make it a separate issue in the bond election.
That's right. And something else, you know, with CYFL and the league programs that used to play at our basketball, different types of like Faith Family, they have an organization that's a league. The CYFL, I just said that, but there are other organizations that play on our fields that if we could reach out to those groups and get their vote to where when they see their kids playing in a brand new stadium would be ideal for marketing.
Well, I think if we could also reach out to like our band directors and our fine arts, that we could pull in marching competitions also. Our facility right now cannot accommodate those kind of things. So our kids are always going out of town to go to competitions. But if we could get stuff like that in, brings people and revenue into the community also.
That's a great point.
So you think the community
pretty well-rounded, all-inclusive report that detailed out deficiencies there, but I didn't see anything that was identifying, you know, what operational necessities are there that have to be addressed. Because once we have those for each campus, we could look at and answer that question: what is the need? You know, from an operational standpoint, these are the bare minimum repairs that we need to do. And once we have that across the board, we compare that to our current capacity. I think we got to answer that question first. Another question that I want to be able to answer is, if we increase, say, that INS tax rate by 1 cent, what does that increase our capacity by? That way we kind of have an idea of what are we going to target. Because if we're, you know, a long way short of what our capacity is, and we know we've got to increase it 10 cents, might not have the support for that. It's hard for me to answer how much the taxpayers will support. I don't have enough of the variables in front of me.
Then you also, will increase area that you need of again, those ancillary spaces. So I'll get into that in a bit, obviously. Hey, Dr. Baumwald. Hey, one thing that we're talking about is, and I've seen this before, is how Victoria ISD compares to similar like-sized districts in terms of tax structure and tax rate.
Yes, and that's information that we have shared with other task forces and with our board previously when talking about budgeting and other topics. And so we already have much of that data prepared, and that is something we will definitely plan to share out with this task force as our work moves forward.
One thing I just wanted to say, because I didn't say earlier when it was sort of my turn, is that something I've heard moving into the community since the 2017 bond, went up for election and did not pass. As folks have said, well, they just wanted to fix the athletic facilities. They were only talking about athletic facilities. If it was more about the academics and teaching and kids learning better, then I definitely would have voted for it. And so I feel like a lot of that bond issue had to do with the messaging of what is this money going towards? And I've heard a lot of folks, at least with our Southside community group, that's like, give us better schools. Yeah, for sure. We want to spend money on that. But if it's just going to build more gyms or football fields, and I know our football fields are not in the best condition either, then that's not the only thing that we wanted to focus on. We need our money to go to kids learning. So that's something I have heard since moving into the community some. Sorry, we have to select a spokesperson, and Natalie and Mr. Dan, I was a spokesperson last week, so I'm barred from being the spokesperson.
Seconds if one of y'all want to be the spokesperson. But one thing to remember also is everybody here understands the process of what we're talking about. How do we communicate that to our community that has no idea what we're talking about, to make them understand what we're trying to put out there? So we've got to keep that in mind also. You know, we're at a level we understand it, but will our community understand it? Correct. Correct. Perfect. Like a countdown.
Well, it's pulled some of our people back in, and it's slowly pulling the rest, it looks like. While we wait for the rest of our group to come in, I will just tell you, if you're ever in the position of being in charge of the breakout groups and you don't like to interrupt people as a personal thing, it's really hard to hit the button that you know someone's in the middle of a sentence and then they're gone. So just know that I don't like that, and I apologize if you're the person who's caught mid-sentence when the group comes back together. But I bet I overcome that feeling as we move forward. So we have 7 total groups, and being mindful of time, I know this is a big topic, but we're going to ask you to summarize 1 to 2 minutes max what the conversation looked like in your group tonight. And I will preface this with, this is a big conversation. It's certainly not a conversation that we'll only spend 15 or 20 minutes over the course of our time, but we wanted to introduce this conversation and get you to start thinking about it, and to think about it as you're out in the community and talking to others, because part of the blessing of having a task force is that you extend beyond just this group right here. And one of our expectations is that you're going to go out and you're going to talk to your the people that you know and that you interact with, and that this will be a part of what you share with them, and that you'll bring back feedback so that it really expands our reach. With that said, the groups are numbered of sorts. I'm not sure if people know what group number they were in, but we're going to go backwards tonight. And I will ask group 7 if they have a spokesperson and if you know who you are.
Hi, this is Valerie. Dr. Bonewall, do you mind repeating the actual question that you presented us before we broke out?
I do not. I've got a printout here. I want to make sure I say it correctly. Knowing we have some capacity at our current INS tax rate, what level of tax increase would be supported by our community to address facility needs at this time?
Okay, thank you. Our small group was in agreement that we feel most taxpayers would be comfortable with, you know, the smaller the number, the better, because they don't want to feel like they're receiving a huge tax increase. But we all were in agreement that when the last bond was presented, it may not have been promoted or presented in the best way. And people focused more on the big number of how much we were spending total versus how much it was just impacting each taxpayer. We didn't discuss this in our small group, but I'll say as a parent coming from Crane Elementary, I think we're the ESL school. I'm not sure. I think we started that last year. all of the bond presentations I went to, which was many because it was presented before every award ceremony, every school function, someone would come out and kind of promote it. It was never done in anything but English, you know, by the, I guess, superintendent. So I think that we missed an opportunity to involve a lot of people that maybe English isn't their primary language, to understand how this is going to impact their kids and how it's going to help their kids long term, not only for athletics, but academic and for their school facilities as well. Especially Crane is a lot of schools in Hopkins that kids have been displaced from Gross and other things and had to move around, and they were part of the, you know, school that was rezoned. So I think that's important to stress that this is to help our facilities, is to make better facilities. So we discussed that in our small group. We thought that was important to point out.
Excellent. That's a great recommendation for us to consider and be mindful of moving forward. How about group 6?
Okay, I'm speaking for group 6. However, I explained that I'm not a community member because I just got here, but the consensus of the group was as small as increase as possible. And if we kept the focus on academics, the buildings and the schools, and not on anything extracurricular right now, that's what we should focus. And I think the number was somewhere around any number that could support 100 million is without raising the taxes too much.
Thank you very much, group 6. Mr. Davis, how about group 5?
I'm group 5, and we didn't come up with a final number. The consensus was as low as possible, but also keeping in mind the great facility needs. We also discussed needing more information to talk to the community and to answer questions comparatively about our total tax for debt service compared to other like-size districts and communities. Because I know I see the reality every day at my school, but I go home to my husband who's a business owner, and he talks to other people in the community, and sometimes the questions he asks are more on that comparative business side. And so if we're able to provide some of those answers to help them be more comfortable.
Excellent. And that's definitely information that we can bring back to the group to share. How about group 4?
I am speaking for group 4. So we did not land on a number, but the consensus was that we need to have open dialogue and educate the community. And if we are meeting the needs of the facilities, that a bond may be more embraced by the community. We need to focus on the needs, roofs, HVAC, renovations, that we can't pay teachers more and then put them in rooms with leaky roofs. And that hopefully the research that we're doing now will provide people a better buy-in to the bond. And then it was mentioned that no tax increase may be more welcomed by the community.
Thank you very much, group 4. And Ashley, how about group 3?
I'm speaking for group 3. So we also did not come up with an exact number, but what we did talk about, we do feel we need a little bit more information in order for the community to get behind any type of tax increase. We're kind of wondering if the district has, we've kind of seen the facility assessments, but if the district has kind of prioritized what is the urgent need versus cosmetic needs on that. So if it's more of an urgent need with fixing the roof, the HVACs, it would be easier for us to promote that to community to get behind it if we need a tax increase. So that's just some of the stuff we talked about.
Excellent. And I've described this process sort of like a funnel, in that we are starting very high and broad, and we will work our way down to specifics. And part of that process will be bringing forward some district identified concerns and more immediate priorities, and getting task force feedback on those. So that definitely is the direction that we're headed as we move forward. Group 2?
We may be group 2. I don't know.
You are,
I'm
sir.
going to speak then. a lot of what was discussed earlier, that was kind of some of our discussions, like the last bond issue, there was a lot of negative towards the stadium. So one of the solutions may be, let's split up the bond issue. We may put some of these things as separate so it doesn't kill the whole bond issue. Also, we've only had, 2 bond issues in the last, 30 years or whatever. Maybe we're not doing them enough. Maybe they need to be done every 5 years, but smaller groups. And that way it keeps it balanced out, so it's continuously addressing the needs and not doing these big major things, trying to hit the taxpayers at that time always, because they see these big numbers, $100 million, that's a lot of money to them. But if they see, 50 or 40 million, every 10 years or so, that may be easier to swallow. So again, maybe we're not addressing this enough from that aspect. So that was 2 things there. And again, the economy, right now, a lot of people are saying, no, there's no way. We've already had the hurricane, we're still getting over COVID is killing businesses in this town. So, but we need to tell people it's going to be 3 years away before these bonds are probably issued. So it's before it really affects your taxes and all that. So that's going to be part of the discussion phase 2, is when these kick in and things like that. So that's again, that's that sharing that information with the public. I think that's it.
Excellent feedback, Group 2. Last but not least, Group 1.
Okay, I'm the spokesperson for Group 1, and we pretty much came up with the same.
Oh, Leandra, you went on to mute.
Technical difficulties. Is that better?
You're back.
Okay. Our consensus was pretty much with what the other groups have come up with. We did not come up with a specific number, but we did say that if a bond was needed, that it would need to be specified for the community and what the community wants. Not putting in the frivolous things that we would like to see, but those things that will actually help us with the aging buildings and keeping up with technology and giving our children the education that they need.
Well, guys, I can't thank you enough for that feedback and the work that you did in the small groups. And it's really, it feels great to know that what you're thinking about, the information that you want, is definitely lining up with where we're planning to go in terms of providing you with information to help us make informed decisions together. We are going to transition now. I'm going to bring back the PowerPoint, and we are going to transition to the next phase of our meeting. Okay. So here, I heard a little bit of talk there in the feedback about, well, maybe we don't need to do really large bonds every decade or 2, but potentially smaller ones that address needs ongoing. And so that may be the case. It'd be interesting to hear how that conversation continues. And it sort of leads to some degree into this next portion of our presentation around short, mid, and long range planning. As Mike heads into this portion of the presentation, I want to make sure I point back to the first charge of this task force. And that is, in fact, to utilize a facility study that we have and that needs assessment to analyze and recommend short, mid, and long-term bond and facility efforts, so that as we're moving forward, we have a plan that's not just about today, but about the future of VISD. And so with that, I am going to invite Mike to take over.
You bet. So I think, like Dr. Bonewald was saying, a lot of the comments that you guys just made were spot on with, I guess, why we actually put these statements.
Oh, Mike just froze up on us.
So we wanted to put these in there to, I guess, kind of ease your mind and give you a little perspective. So number one, it is common for school districts to have more needs than they have the financial capacity to address, right? And I think that's kind of where a lot of that conversation was heading. Number two, many school districts establish a plan to address needs over time in multiple bond cycles in order to manage debt and tax impact to the community. So exactly like we were just talking about. And then number three, the next bond, quote unquote, is pursued when existing debt is paid off or property values increase, creating additional bonding capacity, or when the community wishes to raise the tax rate to address needs. So in terms of, if you're thinking about that term bond cycles, those are the factors that would play into when that next bond in the cycle is supposed to occur. And so just to kind of give you a little visual on what that looks like and how you kind of go about a long range plan with several steps along the way, it's important to start off with your vision, right? What is that long range goal as far as we can see today? And that can, a lot of times it's based on, it could be based on demographics. And I think we talked about, growth really isn't so much a consideration right now, but in terms of how we can see education evolving, right? How far can we see for that, or the types of buildings that we may want to provide, or renovations, new addition, it doesn't matter. What are those, what types of buildings would serve us as far as we can imagine, right? So you want to start off with your long range vision, right? But in order to get there, you have to look at today and think about that initial step, right, to set the course. And so in order to get from that short to long, there's a lot of things to consider and essentially prioritize, right? So that from here to long, let's say that's a 20-year planning vision that we have, right? In order to get to all the different things, achieve them, right? There's going to be intermediate steps along the way, and that's quite all right. That's how you achieve that vision. But it starts today with kind of prioritizing. What are the important things? Where are the needs at the most? And what type of vision do we have for education? At some point, then you get to achieving your goals, right? And that's great because you established a plan. I can guarantee by the time that you reach that, and you can think maybe if that's 20 years out, there's a really good chance that long-range vision that you had has changed, right? All of a sudden, the rest of the world has changed as well, right? Technology changes, approaches to different jobs out there change, the skills that are required for our students change. And so that's okay as well. You pivot, right? You get to that long-range vision and you establish a new one, and you establish a new initial step, and you keep moving forward. And that's very much in line with the way that long-range planning is established. So.
Thank you very much, Mike, for taking us through that description of the short, mid, and long-range planning. The next portion that we're going to move into is a description of kind of a baseline construction costs and what to expect and what we're seeing. And by we, I should say not me, but the professionals out there in the construction field. And so Dan Luttrell from Huckabee Architects is going to walk us through this next portion of our presentation.
Hey, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Baumwald. So as Dr. Baumwald mentioned, this is just a kind of a snapshot using historical data. This is certainly not assuming any projects specific to Victoria ISD and any potential bond projects. Again, this is just historical data that we've been tracking. And what we're showing currently here is, the historical cost for new elementary schools per square foot for both the South Texas region, which encompasses, from basically I-10 south. So, San Antonio and Victoria would all fall on that. And then as compared to all of Texas, again, we track not only Huckabee projects, but also non-Huckabee projects as we gather that information on any school project that is built that we can get that data on. And as you can see, from 2015 to 2019, school costs have increased fairly dramatically, I guess you could say. Obviously, we don't have 2020 data completed at this time. So obviously, this is always a moving target or a work in progress. But again, for elementary schools right now, we're seeing in our region for cost per square foot for a new facility of about $246 a square foot. On the next slide, we have the same information, except it's for middle schools or intermediate and middle schools. Again, South Texas and all of Texas, tracking a large range of projects that we have data for. And similarly, you can see the cost have increased again, fairly dramatically, where right now we're, at the end of 2019, the average was about $269 a square foot if you were to consider new construction. And then again, I know high schools aren't necessarily a consideration currently because Victoria ISD is running with 2 relatively new high schools, but we want to show that same data just to complete the picture on elementary, middle school, and high school construction cost per square foot. However, we understand that Victoria ISD may not be in the market for new schools, certainly not due to growth as we've learned. Possibly, there's been some consideration for campus replacements, but we know that obviously not every campus is subject to a replacement. So we also have looked at some, again, recent examples of renovation projects to include just renovations or renovations and additions. So what you see in the yellow category are renovations only. And the trouble with this is the cost per square foot varies widely depending on the scope that is undertaken. So you see these renovations say, refresh throughout school, including kitchen and football field. And generally a refresh is, finishes, millwork, floors, ceilings, generally not inclusive of entire building systems like roofs and HVAC systems, which we know through the assessment working with John Urbano and staff that that's really a large need within the district. Again, we're not presupposing what projects are, but to consider that those refreshes generally don't include that scope. That scope adds about another $25 a square foot for roofing and another $25 a square foot for HVAC replacements. So add another $50 just to do replacements of those 2 systems. Again, for an approximate $1 per square foot amount. The blue category, the light blue category, is if you were to do a classroom addition. Again, we understand that Victoria ISD is not in a growth mode, but should there be a decision that a campus needed classrooms, then again, you can see the $1 per square foot amount jumps, and you can see the middle school jumps more dramatically than Windmere Elementary School and even Ford Elementary School. Again, that's largely due to the scope involved. And as Dr. Bonewald mentioned earlier, the funnel, today's information is just big picture, and we're working behind the scenes to actually take the assessment data and try to put valuations to it so that we can help define actual Victoria ISD potential projects as is determined by the committee as we move forward. So I'm working behind the scenes, all of us are working behind the scenes to produce these cost values for various scopes so that we can help define what that scope could be for these. And then lastly, the green category is if you're to do a core space addition. So that would be like a library or an auditorium or a cafeteria, which again, we understand that Victoria ISD has a pretty severe need for cafeterias at the elementary schools. Each of those campuses have been added onto over the years for classroom capacity, but the cafeterias have not been extended, or maybe the dining area, but the kitchens and serving areas. So we understand that may be a big consideration. And you can see because those core spaces generally cost more to build, there's a lot more specialty equipment. You can see that those dollars per square foot historically averaged, and these are real projects that we have data on, increased dramatically. Again, you're building less square footage, so it costs more per square foot, but you're not building an entire campus's worth of that square footage at that cost. So the things that we also consider as we're building these project budgets is we understand what we think the construction costs are today. Again, using historical data, we have contractor partners, but we also get some of our data from on what does it cost today to do X, Y, or Z type of work. And then we look at when that project, if a bond were passed, let's say the bond were called in February for a May bond election, how long it would take to design the project, how long it would take to bid the project. So then we look at that escalation cost of what we think the future value of this work that we've identified and costed based on today's dollars, what we think it's going to cost, again, using that historical factor for escalation. And we've been tracking this data for many, many years. And so we have a pretty good idea. Again, it's no perfect crystal ball, and it certainly doesn't constitute a bid, but it's more than just a guess. So then we arrive at what we think the actual construction cost will be when the contract bids, when the contractor actually tells you how much they'll build it for. So we take that total amount, and then the total project cost or the turnkey cost, again, is not just that amount of money, because in order to get that design, in order to get the permits for from the city or the jurisdiction, in order to do materials testing to ensure that it's built correctly, there are soft costs involved. Surveying, again, what's shown here. that we have to add to the cost of the construction project. If you need new furniture, fixtures, and equipment, which would include obviously building furniture, classroom chairs, cafeteria tables, those types of things, if needed, then we need to add the value of that so that you get that total turnkey project. Additionally, if there's any new technology needed for that campus, if it needs new servers, if there's a new telephone system, new security, again, all this will be scoped as we move forward and actually assign project or define project budgets and project scopes. I don't think this applies to Victoria, but it does apply to a total project turnkey cost. Is there any land purchase and acquisition costs needed? Again, I know Victoria ISD has, the campuses have a lot of property, so it may not apply, but it could. It needs to be considered. And then the last component for a total bond project budget for that turnkey cost are the project contingencies. And all that is a little sum of money set aside to cover any unforeseen or unexpected items that occur during construction. And especially with renovation projects, again, the assessment is a visual assessment. I didn't go up and tear into walls and do anything destructive. So, it's a best guess on the condition. But when we actually start tearing into walls and doing the construction work, we may find something we didn't expect to find. So that contingency money is built into the project to cover those unexpected costs. The good thing is if the contingency money is not needed to be spent, that goes back to Victoria ISD, back into the big bucket of money. It doesn't go to the contractor. And that pot of money is carefully monitored throughout the duration of the project so that we ensure that it's not unnecessarily spent. So just some examples. Again, these have not been scoped. These have not been designed. These have not been programmed to exactly what would be needed. But just some examples if the committee were to decide we do need to do some campus replacements. A new elementary school with a capacity comparable to Chandler Elementary School, 550 student capacity, which I believe really would cover a majority of the district campuses, elementary school campuses. We're looking at, again, using those costs that we saw in the previous chart with a couple of assumptions that this project would bid in May of 2020 with an opening date for students to go in 2023. And this goes to the point made by one of the gentlemen during the share back from our small group instruction, our small group breakout, is that these projects won't be coming online for some time. But anyway, the 550 student capacity campus equates to about a $23.5 million project budget. And again, the other numbers are just showing that the economy of scale as you increase the capacity, if needed for more students. 800 student capacity campus is about $37,400,000. And again, that's because there's more classrooms, obviously, but also those core spaces are larger. The cafeteria is larger. The library is larger. They may have more than one gym to accommodate that larger student population. And then the last column or the last row is, again, if we were to increase that capacity to 900, again, just showing what we think that today's dollars will buy in the future if that were a decision of the committee to proceed with a campus replacement. And we did the same thing for middle school, again, using same assumptions. However, we think that if this were the case, it would bid a little bit later because it takes longer to design a larger facility. So we believe that it would bid probably in January of 2023, open in August of 2024. And again, 900 student capacity would be around $53.3 million using today's dollars capitalized or extrapolated forward. 1,000 student capacity would be 71 million. These are big numbers. And then 1,200 student capacity would be 74 million. Again, using actual historical data that we do have. So I know that Ann showed us, the way to get to $100 million, and I'm showing you a way to spend it real fast if this were a decision to do a campus replacement.
I want to just follow up what Dan shared there and reiterate something for the group. And I appreciate the work that Dan and Mike and the team have done to bring really just some context forward to us. We wanted to make sure that sometimes we're surprised at what things can cost. And when we hear about potential funds that may be available, it helps to put things into context with what things are costing in today's world. And certainly these are just approximations, and we did not ask Dan and Mike to help bring us some numbers about a new elementary or a new middle school because there's been some decision that that's going to happen. It's really just around bringing context to our whole group's conversation about prioritizing needs, and then determining what our community can support. With that clarification, going to invite Mike to come back in to talk about renovation versus new construction considerations.
You bet. Thank you. So there's always a question when you talk about renovating buildings, where you start to think, okay, we are talking about renovating everything within the building. Does it just make more sense to do new? Right. And so we just kind of wanted to walk you through a lot of the things that there's a lot of considerations. We wanted to walk you through those. And so if questions kind of start to come up in your mind about it, you can, look back on this and say, oh, well, yes, that is a typical question to have. And so if you're looking at existing building considerations, right? So you might think about the building condition, right? In terms of how much of that building is needing to actually be replaced or renovated. Where you start to say, okay, just like I had said before, this building is 100,000 square feet and we're touching 90,000 square feet of it, maybe it's time to consider new. There is adequacy of spaces, right? So I think we kind of talked about that a little bit when we were presenting the facility assessment and having conversations with principals. Are the spaces that are within your existing space, even if it was to be renovated, would they be adequate for the type of education that you want in there? And even if it's an administrative room, are they going to get you the type of spaces that you really want out of your building? Historical significance as well, right? What parts of a campus might need to, might have either historical or just community significance, really, right? So there are a lot of buildings that might not be considered historical, but for a community, they're very significant, right? And so you might want to consider that and say, you know what, this can't be new, this needs to be renovated. There's equity within the district, right? And so you start to think, okay, if I'm going to be doing a renovation to one elementary school, can it be done to all of them? Should it be done to all of them? If we're going to go new, right? What can we do to other campuses to make them more equitable to the other ones? And I have some examples that I'll kind of share with you as well that kind of illustrate that. Campus configuration. If you have a general master plan for an elementary, let's say we establish that 20-year vision for our schools, and along with that, there's a master plan for certain campuses. 20 years from now, we'll do X, Y, and Z additions till we get to this point with the campus. Establish a master plan. Can the existing facilities actually accommodate that? So that's what campus configuration refers to. And then there's code compliance, right? Which pieces of the existing conditions actually comply with code? Which ones would we need to bring up to meet code? And what are the costs of doing that? How do those relate to the cost of new construction, right? So you might go in there wanting to renovate a building, maybe to make all of the spaces more equitable. As you do that, you touch certain spaces, and then you need to bring other spaces up into compliance with code, so the cost actually goes up. And so those are a number of things to consider just when you're looking at the building. Then there's also cost considerations, right? So when you think of energy operations and maintenance, think of your existing buildings that are 40 to 50 years old. How do what is the energy cost for that compared to a new building, right? And then apply that cost to potential renovations versus new construction. There is demolition cost, and that's just something to consider. When you're talking about renovation, you could put a $1 per square foot to the renovation, but you also have to think about demolition as well. If by chance you explore replacement type of projects or whatnot, or not the whole school, but maybe you're demoing a certain portion so you can do a better addition. There's cost to demolition anyhow. So then there's land and site infrastructure too for new construction. You can't forget about, right? So there's sometimes a savings to doing renovations as opposed to doing new construction. Utilities is another cost, bringing utilities to a site. So, and then construction phasing and portables. That's thinking about, okay, if we're going to do additions or renovations, keeping our kids safe throughout that. How is that going to happen? Can that be done? And if it can be done, is the community supportive of that situation for the let's say 1 to 3 years that might take? And then you have a return on investment at the bottom there too. And that's simply thinking about, okay, if we're going to spend X amount of dollars on a renovation or addition, is it really going to get us what we want for our students, right? Is it going to represent that grand vision that we have for our long-range plan? So those are a number of considerations. I touched upon this right here, triggering code compliance. Once you do start doing any kind of renovation within a building, there are code implications to that. And so in the 3 boxes, just starting on the left there, you have maintenance and replacement. So if by chance at a campus you are just replacing your HVAC units or your roofing, it's just those items that you're touching that need to be brought up to code compliance. And then you have these other two terms, phase 1 and phase 2 renovations. That's not in terms of like actual phasing. That's actually a term from building code. Phase, actually, you can kind of think of it in terms of levels, right? A level 1 renovation versus a level 2 renovation. And so that's all to say that if you're touching a building and you're doing less than 50% of that building area, all you need to do is comply with that area that you're touching only. On a level 2, if you're touching more than half of the building, then it turns out you have to bring the whole building into compliance. So again, that has cost implications, and then you start to play that balance game between, do I renovate, do we build new? And so just going along with that, and also thinking back to the long-range plan conversation that we had, we wanted to provide you with a couple of just case studies, really, just to kind of tell you, there are other people, other districts out there that are in the same boat in terms of having to prioritize certain things and establish a long-range plan. So this was Georgetown back in 2015. There were 4 main campuses that were a part of that bond, and going into the bond, their main consideration was growth plus educational needs. And so you see, just to explain all 4 real quick, Wagner Middle School, you can see that's kind of a brand new school that was established through the 2015 bond, and that was put in the bond specifically because of growth in a certain area within their district. Next to it is Annie Pearl, and that's a 1953 building. You can see the image on the top right corner. If you can't see that correctly, that's water. It definitely had some flooding issues. It was a 1953 building that was largely untouched. So it had its aging conditions. But they also had some growth going on in that area. It's actually part of the Wagner community as well. And so they needed to address growth in that area too. And then what you also see is Tippett Middle School on the bottom left. And so what you can see from Tippett, especially compared to the one above it, is that what they considered was, if we're going to be providing a new middle school, and we're going to be thinking, let's do this, let's give it a nice 21st century educational environment, right? Let's not do it the same way that we've done the last 2 middle schools, which are a little bit more traditional. If we're going to do that for Wagner, then Tippett, which is our oldest middle school, is going to need some upgrades as well. And while we're at it, let's make it as equitable to the new one as possible, right? And so that's kind of how they looked at growth needs and aging needs in one area, and then equitability in the other. And then the 4th project in there is the Hammerland Center, really. It's called Williamson, or it was Williams Elementary School. It was a 1923 building, and that's where they wanted to put their district administration offices in there. And so, Greg, I'm going to kind of let you start turning the pictures a little bit. You can see there's major additions and renovations, and what they did was $26.1 million worth of work at Tippett Middle School to make it as equitable as possible to Wagner, which was brand new. Now, if you look at the construction cost for Wagner, that was $55 million, right? Tippett, they put about half of that to their renovations and additions there, so that's quite a bit of money. It's just under 50% essentially of what a new construction would cost. What they did there is they provided new core spaces, so it's new library, new main entrance, which you're looking at. The library is on the 2nd floor there. Behind what you're looking at is also a new commons area, cafeteria, learning stairs, stage, and that kind of thing. What they kept actually was their athletics and classroom wings. And they actually used we renovated the classroom wings within there. We put some windows within walls and, gave new furniture and finishes throughout, so that essentially the whole campus, even though some of it was kept, the whole campus looks new. And it's, again, as equitable to Wagner as possible. Pearl, 1953, that was replaced. So they replaced that one. It's a $31.4 million elementary school replacement. And it also very much follows, even though the aesthetics looks different, the interior, it actually follows very much the same educational philosophy for the spaces that were provided. And then for Williams, in terms of taking a 1923 building and making it something that actually is a 21st century environment for educators, they put the $14 million into that, right? And to explain the $14 million for an administration building, part of it was saying this is a professional learning environment where teachers throughout the district go to learn how to teach in these new spaces on a regular basis and get together and collaborate to keep up with new educational trends. So it's very much a building that it replicates the type of learning environments that you see in the new spaces. And it's used very regularly by teachers and administrative staff. So that was Georgetown in a nutshell in 2015. That's how they prioritized their projects. For Channelview, we wanted to show this one to you as well. So this is a 2019 bond program, and the 4 major projects that came from this bond was Channelview High School. That was a 1996 building. It's not that old, right? But they saw a need for renovations within it and some additions because of changes in education. You see Alice Johnson Junior High below that. Alice Johnson, the interior of it was touched a little bit in their previous bond, which was about 10 years ago. They got to a point where they said, we'd really like to do some renovations to this, but it was touched 10 years ago. People in the community are going to remember that, and it might not be the right time because they might not support too much money going towards a school that was quote unquote just touched. So you have to be sensitive to that aspect as well. And then you have Days of Allah Elementary School, a 1945 school. It had been added on to a couple times. You can imagine the type of learning environments. It looked like a 1945 school. And then you also have Cobb and Shockler elementary schools below. Those are actually what they decided to do is combine those, but those are older campuses as well. They had those are actually ones where you might consider things like energy and maintenance costs, because Cobb was actually one of their smallest schools. I believe the capacity was just under 400, but it was an older building. It didn't have a lot of students. It's on the same site as Shockler, which had a lot of aging and actually structural conditions that they were looking at as well. And so they thought, well, can we address 2 in 1 and actually combine those two? So for the high school, again, what they wanted to do is actually provide a CTE addition, as well as a performing arts center addition to that high school, because they saw CTE as having a big influence on students, and they're being prepared for their future. And then they also wanted to renovate spaces within, like their library. That's the image you see here, and kind of tie their library in with their dining area to make a big, large common space that students can use throughout the day. So that was their priority. They instead of looking at the middle schools, they focused on $55 million on renovations and additions to the high school. For Alice Johnson, they took that cost down a little bit because, again, it had been addressed previously. It's largely kind of doing that refresh that Dan was talking about, maybe finishes throughout throughout parts of the campus, but giving it kind of a facelift as well. And so they only put $14.7 million to Alice Johnson Middle School. And then they also looked at the elementaries, right? Replaced Days of Allah actually on the exact same site. And so they put $34.3 million into that replacement project. So you go from a 1945 building to a building, like you see right there. That was important to them. And picking Days of Allah in particular, I think because they felt it was an underserved or a part of the community that they felt really needed it, that in the previous bond it hadn't been addressed. So And then with Cobb and Schockler, another view, sorry, of Dave's of Olive there. Cobb and Schockler, again, $45.6 million, but that's actually, if you compare that to the $34.3 million from Days of Olive, Cobb and Schockler is actually addressing two of their smaller campuses and combining them into one. So the cost went up, but it covers, it has a larger capacity. So again, that's how Channelview addressed their aging needs and their evolving needs in education. So a little bit different from Georgetown, probably different from the way that you guys want to go to. Everybody is unique, and that's really the point of showing you all of these examples, that there's a way to kind of tackle this long range approach. It's going to be unique to you guys, and so you get a chance to make it unique.
Thank you, Mike. One of the things that we started talking about with our bond planning task force as early as last year was we have a number of campuses that are at different stages of their life and will have different needs. And some of the questions that came up were, how do districts prioritize and look at when it makes sense to repair, renovate, or rebuild? And so we asked Mike to help us see how some other districts have addressed that with facilities that needed one approach or the other, to show that, again, even within other school districts in their bond programs, sometimes it makes sense to do repairs, to renovate, or to rebuild. And so we want to build upon that in our small discussion. But before we do that, I did notice that Adam had placed something in the chat regarding the fact that Victoria has a high cost per square foot to build homes, which will probably mean a high cost to build or refurbish schools. He asked the question, what was the contingency fund for the last bond? That would have been like the 2007 bond. And do we need to have a higher percentage for future potential bonds? Since I understand that we had to cut things out of school builds that were in progress during the last bond. Any thoughts, Mike or Dan, that you'd want to share in regard to cost per square foot based on region? I know we had some conversation around how that's looked at regionally. Anything you'd want to add based on Adam's question around costs for building homes versus costs for building other types of structures?
Dan, I'll let you start.
Okay, yeah. I didn't want to both tie them up. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we understand Victoria's home market is possibly higher than average. However, I would think that, projects in the commercial realm that schools fall under would be attracting contractors, from far and wide, from San Antonio, Houston, Austin, even, none of those are that far away. So honestly, I don't know that the average would be that different because of the difference in cost for home construction necessarily. I mean, there's, it's a totally different group of workers. The labor pool is different. The requirements are different. But to address the idea of, having to cut things from previous bonds or the previous bond, the contingency obviously is not intended to make up any gaps in the bidding market or, in that. The contingency is already built into the project budget once bid and awarded. So I would have to believe that, either those contingencies were spent more quickly than I guess would be anticipated, or, things were VE, value engineered, which is kind of a dirty word in most people's eyes, where you cut something out that you wanted. So, I mean, I can only assume, not having specific knowledge of those projects, that may be the case, that something, again, was value engineered. I don't know for sure if that meant because they were out of money. Or
and Dan, I don't want you to ask you to have to go back and prognosticate about something that occurred that you weren't a part of. But to address Adam's point around that, I think it underscores part of what our conversation was earlier in the meeting around working with your financial advisor, and part of the importance of what is trending into the complicated versus the complex, of making sure that you have good valuations and good estimates for what you say you're going to do, so that you don't over promise and under deliver to your community. And so those are certainly things that our leadership team and any groups that we might work with for any type of project in the future, that we would have to have at the top of our mind throughout the entire process, from planning to putting things in place, that we don't overpromise and underdeliver.
Absolutely, that's always a big concern of mine. Helping to develop these values. But again, I do believe that bringing in commercial contractors from the bigger marketplaces, I think, does give us a little bit better confidence in the averages of cost. Using data of projects that those contractors have built, and not necessarily the local or semi-local home builder contractors, for example. I do know that there's been quite a bit of work at UHV that we can certainly look into costing there and see if that meets the trends, or if it is over our trends that we're seeing, and then discuss how to adjust based on that.
Thank you, Dan and Mike. The next part, and we're trending toward the end of our meeting tonight, but we are going to jump back into one more small group discussion, and we're going to ask you to take, about 8 minutes. So we're going to be quick here, and we can always revisit this conversation, and we will moving forward. But just some initial conversation around what are the drivers for new construction versus renovation in your mind? And if cost is one of those drivers, what is a reasonable cost percentage threshold for triggering new construction instead of renovation? In your mind, when does it make sense to not renovate, but to build new? Not that we're looking to necessarily do that now, but it is a part of mid and long range planning to have an idea of a threshold that our district can use as a guide for making those types of decisions. So with that, I'm going to send you guys back into your breakout rooms.
Get the general construction fee. He said, no, we're an architecture company. I'd rather have an architecture fee that we could get in the future. What he just presented to us was a means to go above $100 billion in fees, and the renovation does not pay an architecture fee. Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Lawrence, you're muted.
I'm trying to be really sensitive to our time constraints. So we're going to have a very quick round robin to address the questions that we are assembled to address. So anyone want to, and actually hopefully you'll still be our spokesperson.
Sure. The first question was, what are the drivers for new construction versus renovation? So who wants to go first?
I guess I'll go first. In our first meeting, we were talking about how we're basically almost not wanting to, if we could get by with not increasing our tax rate, that would be approved easier by voters. So if we're saying that, then obviously cost is our major factor here. Mm-hmm. And then it says, if cost is the driver, what is the reasonable cost percentage threshold? That's starting to kind of get out of my pay grade here. I would love for somebody to speak up on that side. Anybody, thoughts? Threshold for triggering new construction.
The threshold for triggering a new is if we want to get a bond issue passed, we don't trigger new construction.
And if I might add for the group, I think a part of what we're trying to talk, and this will be an extended conversation over our meetings, is as a part of our mid and long range planning, we want to have some conversations about when we might identify that it makes more sense to rebuild versus to renovate a campus. Much like if you had an old car and you had expensive repairs that were needed and it wasn't going to last much longer, at what point do you determine that it makes more sense to get a new car versus repair? Not that there's one right answer to that, but that's what we're searching for.
I think one of the things we have to really look at is utility cost. I know just a few months ago, I had to replace my central air conditioning unit, and my electric bill went down quite a bit. So it was a good investment. So, you know, I would say we have to look at utilities, and that comes back to cost, you know. So
would you lump maintenance into that as well? Because if we're doing new construction and doing big renovations, that may give us more money on the maintenance end.
Yeah, but also if a school has high maintenance costs, like that means it's continually having problems,
right?
You know, like kind of where you're going. That might be something. Go ahead, Dr. Lawrence, I'm sorry.
No, I was saying that's an excellent point.
Of each individual space that we're talking about, then I think that would help everybody understand.
Yeah, because I'd agree, building something new is a lot better than putting a Band-Aid on it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Bonwell, I've done 2 bonds in different districts, and we were able to take the groups and walk them through all the facilities that we were talking about updating or changing. Or just take them through all the facilities in the district. Is that, and I know COVID's here, so can we do what Dana said, do a video tour and let them see these things? Because nobody's reading that manual.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion, and actually something that with our communications department, we've already begun discussions around creating video tours. We did do some in-person tours last year with this group in October, November, to a few facilities, but more so to show the compare and contrast of some of our newer facilities and what some of our aging facilities offer and the lack of equity potentially there. Yes, to be able to show the entire community some of the various conditions through video tour is what we plan to do.
Schools are costing so much money to replace, or we do something for all, and I think that's really important for us to think about too.
I have one more question, Greg. And we were talking about doing videos. Would it be possible for Johnny's group, and I'm sorry, Johnny, for doing this to you, you know, how many work orders come into for O'Connor for a leaky roof? How much money have we spent on that?
Yeah, so as we move forward in our process, we're going to be bringing you more detailed information. And that's going to spur other questions that you have, but we're going to talk about where are our at or near or end of life items like roofs, HVAC units, where are most of our maintenance calls, where do schools experience the greatest problems around those types of issues. We will be bringing that to you.
Good. Okay.
So Megan and George, you see how power works in this district. See, I'm new, so I say Dr. Bonwall. Dana has influence, so she says Greg.
It's because I'm older than he is.
Please know that I happily answer to either one of those, and I'm glad to be with you to tell you I'm going to end this right now, okay? Okay, we got back in when we closed the meetings much quicker that time. I know that topic is something that warrants much more conversation than we're able to have in this short amount of time. And so, one, I just want you to know we recognize that, and that you need more information to potentially come to some sort of consensus around potentially defining a threshold. But we want you to start thinking about those things in those terms. And so, given where we are with time, I'm just going to ask for a 1-minute share out from each of our groups here and ask for your grace to let us go maybe about 5 minutes past 8 o'clock tonight. And if you need to leave, totally understand. And let's flip it around and go with group 1. Just a 1-minute share out from your spokesperson.
Okay, so group 1, just some of the things that we talked about as far as like if a renovation is done, what's the life of that renovation compared to building a new facility, the historical significance of the building or portions of the building, the amount of space within that facility that would need to be renovated compared to building new, what sort of code compliance issues there may be with an older building being renovated and how much would have to be done to bring that up to code. And then of course, cost would be something to factor in. We didn't really set an exact percentage with, there's probably other factors that would need to be considered along with the percentage of renovation to new build costs to really make that decision as to where that threshold is.
Excellent work, group 1. How about group 2?
Same as what group 1 said, except one thing was maybe even looking at what the additional ongoing cost of maintenance is. You can renovate, but it may be costing you the same amount of money to maintain that building. So that all has to come into calculations of replacement as well.
Very good.
But all
Very
the other
good
things
point.
she mentioned as well, of course.
Anything additional to add from group 3?
Looking at the costs of demo, and some of our schools being older probably has asbestos somewhere in them, and the cost of demoing that versus just renovating it. Other than that, it was pretty close to the same.
Thank you, group 3. How about group 4? Anything additional we haven't discussed already?
We talked about originally if cost is a driver for what decision we're making. We originally stated that we would not want a tax increase. It was also mentioned looking at population shifts, that some areas the population may be decreasing, and if that area needs a renovated school or a new build, that the community might be less supportive of supporting a bond in areas where the population is decreasing. And then everything else that was mentioned too.
Thank you, group 4 and Ashley. How about group 5?
Mr. Luttrell had some great information for us. I could have him share, but he summarized his expertise for us. He said a lot of districts go with the 50 to 60% threshold. If you want to elaborate, Mr. Luttrell.
I certainly can, but I don't want to bias the whole group too much. I know that we've talked about this quite a bit internally with our own group represented here, but that has been a fairly historical percentage that I've seen a lot of districts use is, if the cost of renovation is 60% or greater, then new construction becomes more of the discussion, or at least it becomes a discussion point to consider before you just discard that idea or discount it.
Thank you. Thank you both. How about, I lost track. Are we on group 5 or 6?
Group 6. And
group 6.
Echoing what everybody else said, the renovation cost would probably exceed what new construction would cost because of all the maintenance and things like that we have to look at and continue to upgrade.
Thank you, group 6. Any additional things, group 7?
No, sir, we just agreed with what you said, that we would need additional information to decide, what would be more beneficial, renovation versus rebuild.
Thank you all. We're coming right up on 8 o'clock. The last thing that I wanted to share with you is just what topics we are planning to address and share out for next week's meeting. Before I do that, I want to reiterate that we recognize that we are throwing a lot of information at you, a lot of broad information, from financial information to building and architectural considerations. But it's all really important information also, and we think that we need to have some common foundational scope before we start to talk about the findings of the facility assessment and working together to prioritize needs. But we will be moving in that direction, and our information will be becoming much more specific, and that conversation more robust, I imagine, in our coming meetings. Next week, we plan to, one, have Dr. Shepard and Melissa Carell, our Director of Innovation, come and share with the group some of that vision that we talked about for programming for our students moving forward, and how that may impact some of our facility needs, potentially in the mid and long term for bond planning. And also, we will talk in some more specificity about our facility assessment priority items from a district level. So we've had the opportunity to go through this information and look at those things that we feel like as a leadership team, along with our maintenance department and Dr. Shepard and our upper leadership team at Central, these are must-do items. These are things that we feel like we have to tackle. We cannot have rain coming in on our kids and disrupting the ability to teach, to disrupt the learning environment. So we'll be sharing out some things that we feel like are must-dos, and then some things that we feel like if there's capacity, there are things we should do. And then we will ask for your feedback and thoughts on that information. Before we go, the last thing I want to reiterate is if you have some questions that come up as you go out, and please talk to people that you're connected with and bring that back to this conversation. If you want to share out with me prior to our next meeting, thoughts or questions that will help inform our meetings going forward to make sure they are productive and are providing you with the most relevant and important information for us to keep our work moving forward, please know that's what we're here for. And each one of you that contacts myself or our other facilitators, you're helping the process by bringing those items forward. There's certainly things that we as educators and administrators feel are important to have as a part of the conversation. But the reason we have this group is we each come with a perspective, and we need to know what you need to know to help us make well-informed decisions. We certainly fit a lot into 2 hours. Thank you all for your hard work and commitment throughout this, and we look forward to connecting with everyone again next Tuesday. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.